Of course, thanks Peter, it's very honor to have you here. Before we start, I want to make a very quick introduction of Bitpolito. We are a student team of the Polytechnic of Turin. We do education and development on Bitcoin. So we do content creation, events like this, maybe not every time with such a big name. And then we have the lab, where we do different type of projects like cryptographic, mining, Lightning Network, and other things that if you are a tech guys, you should come and join and contribute as well. So today, Peter is going to talk about the Bitcoin Layer 2.
Yeah, so I'm Peter Todd. I done a lot of work on a lot of various things, although frankly I think I'm probably most known for giving speeches at conferences and other events like this. But on occasion I get asked to go and actually do an analysis on protocols and whatnot. And in this case, I'm doing an analysis on soft fork covenant dependent layer 2 reviews. VC firm Folger Ventures wanted me to go and look at kind of the space of all this stuff. But before I go into what exactly all this stuff is, I mean, an interesting question for the audience is, show of hands, how many people have actually used a Lightning wallet? All right, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. How many people have used a Lightning wallet to actually buy something in person? All right, basically everyone who put their hands up. And how many people used a self-custodial Lightning wallet? Now, do you know the difference? Like, did you use, say, Phoenix or Blixt? All right, Phoenix, yeah. Well, Phoenix is definitely one of the better ones out there. There are a lot. But, today's talk really comes from the viewpoint of trying to enable more people to use self-custodial Lightning wallets. Obviously, if you're all using Wallet of Satoshi is ultimately just a database. And, adding more users to fancy databases is pretty easy. I hear Visa and MasterCard are pretty good at it. They have a lot of customers out there. But, Lightning's another matter. But if we're going to get into this stuff, really we got to start with definitions. I mean, what makes layer 2 layer 2? What is the meaning of a layer 2 wallet or a layer 2 system? Well, if we're going to describe what a layer 2 is, surely we should know what a layer 1 is. And I like to define layer 1 as transacting with sort of passive security. Now, Bitcoin itself, the Bitcoin blockchain, of course everyone calls it a layer 1. It was the first thing to kind of get created that allowed you to send money around. But what's interesting about Bitcoin is that if you have a Bitcoin wallet and you have some coins on it, once someone sends you those coins and once the transaction confirms, you don't really have to do anything, right? The coins are kind of just there. You could go and live in a cave for 10 years, maybe because you're hiding from journalists trying to go and accuse you of being Satoshi. And your coins would just sit there. Now, on top of Bitcoin, we've also created systems that extend Bitcoin in ways that still use the security model. One example is RGB, and that's client-side validation, where we use Bitcoin to prevent double spends, but the logic of what the transactions mean, that's all validated on your device. There's also my own open timestamps protocol, which does not do transactions, but what it does do is it timestamps things. And again, it's passive security because when you create a timestamp, you get a math proof leading to a Bitcoin block. But provided the chain itself works, that math proof you can just put in a drawer on a USB stick for 10 years and come back later and validate it later. And there's also merge mining, which out of the 4 in this list, I'm not going to claim merge mining secure, but the way the incentives work is similar to Bitcoin in that, to the extent merge mining works at all, it's just about people mining, people accumulating proof of work, and of course validating the rules of that system. And L1s are cool. Some of them can scale quite a bit. But at the very least, they tend to be slow because it takes a while to come to consensus. So with things like Lightning, we tried to do better. Well, Lightning, we ended up calling an L2. And there's a lot of different definitions of L2 out there. You'll see in a moment some things I rejected. But the definition I came up with for this paper, and I think this is a good definition overall, is L2s are about conglomerating transactions together, taking many different economic transactions and turning them into a small number of on-chain transactions. And especially in the case of Lightning, they leverage reactive security. So first of all, the conglomeration, check, lock time, verify type payment channels, they're an example of just straight conglomeration. Now, you guys may not be familiar with this because they're very obsolete and no one ever really deployed them. They're kind of a stepping stone to get to Lightning. But CLTV payment channels, the key thing about them is basically you have a pot of money. Say I have some money and I create a channel to you. And when I make a payment to you, I'm giving you an option to take more of that pot of money. And every time I give you an option to take even more of it, well, I've effectively transferred funds to you. And that can go on indefinitely, at least in one direction. The problem is, how do we make the money go back in the other direction? Because with CLTV payment channels, it's just transactions. They might not be on the chain yet, but they are just transactions. Well, Lightning adds the ability to make this go in the other direction. And the way it does this essentially comes down to invalidating prior transactions by adding punishment, adding a way to react to the bad person doing the wrong thing. So, in a Lightning channel, if I have sent you, half a Bitcoin, but then we want money to go in the other direction, we can invalidate prior states by giving the other party a secret that they could use to take their money back if one side or the other puts the wrong state on chain. And the key thing is that's a reactive measure. Someone has to actually do something for the system to work. Again, with a normal Bitcoin wallet, I can leave it in a cave for 10 years and it's fine. But with Lightning, generally especially on sort of consumer, if you will, clients, you'll have a time period of something like, say, 1 week, where you can respond to the counterparty trying to steal from you, but after that week's over, they can get the money. And finally, and I'll talk about this more, ARC is another example of this. And ARC isn't channel-based, it's UTXO-based, but it's the same kind of principle. So, in a nutshell, an L2, under my definition, you should either be able to unilaterally withdraw your funds by closing the channel and getting your funds back, or you should be able to prevent the counterparty from benefiting from fraud. An interesting example of this is Lightning HTLCs. So I gave a bit of a talk about what Lightning was, this bit about reactive security, but the other thing that makes Lightning work is that you can send a payment atomically across many different hops. Right? So, if I have a channel to you and you have a channel to her and she has a channel to him, I can make a payment through that route in such a way that when the payment actually goes through, it either goes through or it doesn't. And the underlying mechanism that this uses is about revealing a message that has a certain digest. A message has a certain hash digest. Now, I could go talk on for an hour about all the details of this, but I hope that gets the picture of what's going on here. Now, these HTLCs, they get exposed as an output. Not an output that you hope goes on chain, but an output that could go on chain. Now, in that example, if that payment's going through, imagine if one of the people in the middle just goes offline at the wrong moment. Somehow you have to make this money move. And that's when you start going on chain. That's when people start redeeming HTLCs and so on. But the catch here is, what if I'm only making a Lightning payment of 1 Satoshi? I mean, if you've played with Lightning, you've probably figured out that, yeah, you actually can send 1 Satoshi. And it really is a real payment. If I send 1,000,001 Satoshis, I've sent 1,000,000 Satoshis. That's a fair bit of money. Well, while a bigger HTLC is an example of unilateral withdrawal, as in you always get your money back if you go on chain, a small HTLC ends up being an example preventing the counterparty from benefiting from fraud. Well, how does this happen? Because in small HTLCs, the way the Lightning Protocol works is while the HTLC is in flight, while that transaction is pending, the value of the HTLC in flight gets added to the transaction fee of the transaction that you would use to close the channel. So let's suppose I have a channel open with you. I try to send 1 Satoshi. Now, on either part, regardless whether or not the funds really went through or didn't, no one can benefit from closing the channel to try to steal 1 Satoshi. It's going to go cost, a couple hundred Satoshis in fees at minimum. Thus, your counterparty cannot benefit from fraud. It's economically unfeasible. Of course, we would much rather have unilateral withdrawal. We'd much rather just be able to close stuff and get our money back. And, fraud can be a tricky thing. It isn't always true that the incentives line up the way that they do. It's much easier to not have fraud be possible. But, you do what you can. Finally, since we're talking on definitions, some things I would definitely say are not L2 systems. And we've probably heard Liquid be called an L2, but, Liquid is Blockstream's thing. It's effectively a bank. It's a group of, 10, 15, I forget how many different custodians. And they ultimately have signing authority to sign the Liquid sidechain. There's no unilateral withdrawal there, right? There's no mechanism within the protocol that you can use to get your money back. I mean, obviously you can go call a lawyer and start filing lawsuits, but that's not a mechanism within the protocol. That's an external thing. And it's also not clear in Liquid that within the protocol there would be anything that prevents the custodians from benefiting from fraud. I mean, maybe when they decide to retire, they're just going to steal the money, and from their point of view within the protocol, they're going to earn a lot of money by screwing you over. All right? There's no solid economic reason not to just take your money and run. There's certainly extra protocol reasons, like they'll probably all wind up in jail, and somewhere out there's a list of who those guys are, but that's not within the protocol. Cashew, it's the same deal. Actually, an interesting question. How many in this audience know what Cashew is? Pretty decent numbers. How many have a Cashew wallet? So if I was clever, what I would have done is left a Cashew QR code here for those few guys to go steal. I'll have to remember that for next time. But, again, Cashew is really just another fancy bank. It uses a bunch of clever crypto to protect your privacy, but the custodian of the coins is still the Cashew provider. And finally, state chains, I think is an interesting example. And this was actually one that my client asked me to evaluate. Folger Ventures, did want me to include state chains in the paper. And I looked at it, and I realized that it's not an L2 for an interesting reason, which is the way state chains works is effectively that up until some moment in time, if the counterparty is being honest, they can't steal your money. But if they are dishonest and then do a bunch of other steps, then they can steal your money. And I'm not going to say state chains is a bad idea, but I don't think it quite meets the threshold I really want. I want to be able to transact with dishonest counterparties from day one. I don't want to have to rely on someone like being honest most of the time. And I'll say in academia, there's a real tendency to evaluate protocols on sort of the honest majority assumption or honest players assumption. In Bitcoin, we want much stronger standards than that. So state chains, unfortunately, doesn't quite make it. So the other part of the definitions I'll talk about is, well, what's a covenant? And again, I'll kind of ask a question here. How many people have heard of covenants on Bitcoin? All right. Like, say, CTV? All right, decent number. Like OpCat? All right, decent number. So you might have some idea what this is. Well, I suspect not many of you would think of a pre-signed transaction as a covenant. So what is a covenant? Well, it's a restriction on what transactions could spend an output that's more complex than just this pub key. Of course, if we said check sig is covenant, this would get a little ridiculous. So we limit it a little more. But the role of covenants in systems like in L2 systems really comes down to saying, I want to say in advance how money can be spent. And the way to think about why this is useful is because you got to set up a scenario in an L2 system where certain things have to happen for money to go in certain ways. You got to restrict how money could flow to more than just we signed for it. And this is particularly true for L2 systems that try to scale further. And I'll talk a bit more about scaling later. But in Lightning, again, going back to HTLCs, pre-signed transactions are used as a form of covenant for the reason that HTLCs themselves can be an invalidated state. So imagine, you have a Lightning channel, and at some point in the past, you had an HTLC in flight. That meant the counterparty has a signed transaction with an HTLC output. Well, long story short is that when you invalidate that state, you also need to invalidate the HTLCs. And the process of invalidating the HTLCs means if the HTLC gets put on chain, there must be a timeout window to then get the money back. And I'm not going to go into full details, but long story short is Lightning nodes pass around pre-signed transactions as part of this, so that the only way you can spend an HTLC output is constrained to include a time delay, giving the other party a chance to respond to fraud. All right, it's restraining that output. Now check template verify. That's sort of one of the more obvious versions of covenant. What does it do? Well, it checks that a template matches the spending transaction. And in Bitcoin scripting world, verify just means if it fails that check, the script returns false. And what check template verify actually does is it says, let's take the spending transaction, let's remove the parts of it that that we can't predict in advance, namely the script inputs themselves, and let's hash that. And if that digest matches the digest on the stack, we're good to go. Which really means in that script output, there is only one way to spend. The spending transaction has to match this exactly. It's like having a pre-signed transaction, but unlike a pre-signed transaction, you can actually force this to happen. With a pre-signed transaction, we have to agree to go sign one, and there may be other ways that the transaction could happen. It's also, even if a pre-signed transaction could work, it's a more efficient thing to do. Now, opcat is interesting, and I'll go through some more details later, but basically opcat is a building block. It just says, let's take two strings, concatenate them together, and now we have one string. And as I'll explain in a further slide, you can use this to create covenants basically by taking the parts of the transaction you want to validate and actually building them up to go check that it matches the thing you're signing. Finally, there's a whole pile of covenant proposals that are all like L2 specific. There's like op-evict, there's things that like look at leaves in a tap script. There's things that do magic with trees. I mean, there's a huge variety of them. But they can all kind of get summarized as specific opcodes to do very specific things. And finally, before we go into specific systems, we got to have a bit of a detour, which is talk about mempools. Well, why are we talking about mempools? Well, again, L2s are reactive security. For you to not get your money stolen, you need to be able to get transactions mined. And as it turns out, there's a bunch of barriers potentially getting transactions mined. One example is this thing called the replacement cycling attack. And it's this kind of clever way of basically replacing a transaction in a mempool so that it just disappears. Now this is also kind of an attack on miners, because we're taking a transaction that could be mined, that pays fees, that should be mined, and we're replacing it with a transaction that isn't going to get mined, but in the process, making the mineable transaction disappear. Now I actually propose an opcode to go fix this called op_expire, which kind of helps Lightning avoid this in certain cases by saying, well, you only have a defined time window to go do something. But I'll let you guys look that up for homework. But the other big one, and that's related to replacement cycling, is this thing called transaction pinning. So again, in L2 protocol, you could be in a position where you need to get a transaction mined to not have money stolen from you. Well, if you can pin a transaction in mempools so that it just stays in those mempools but doesn't get mined, you can screw over your counterparty, right? Because eventually some timeout will be reached or something that lets you do something nasty, like take their money. And there's a lot of varieties of transaction pinning. One of the dumbest versions is, and I kind of mentioned at the bottom, turning off transaction replacement. Because ultimately, transaction pinning is really it's an economic attack against miners. It's saying we have an output, we're preventing it from getting spent, we're preventing forward progress being made in a protocol, and we're doing it by putting miners in a position where they're not collecting money. The dumbest way to go do this is Bitcoin used to allow transaction replacement to be turned off. And if you can't replace a transaction, you can't get it to a high enough fee to potentially make it worthwhile to mine. Anyway, we now have full RBF. That's kind of in the past. But man, that was like I think it was a 10-ish, 12-ish something year project to get that in. It's always funny how long things can take in Bitcoin. But anyway. So another part of mempools there is like, how do you go pay fees? If you're using something like check template verify, where the transaction as part of your protocol has to match a particular template, well, what if the fee for it isn't high enough? I mean, how do you add new fee to it? How do you convince miners to mine it? Well, there's a lot of complexity there, but really this comes down to like something called child pays for parent, which is the idea that you can have a transaction that spends an output of another one, but that's what adds the fee. Because after all, if the child transaction has a fee, the only way the miner can collect that fee is if the parent gets mined too. And a few years back, we added support for Bitcoin Core to evaluate this kind of child-parent relationship called child pays for parent. But as we're looking at L2s more, we're realizing that the way we've implemented this isn't ideal. And there's a lot of complexity to how child pays for parent works. There's also this idea called anchors, which is like, well, why don't we have transaction outputs specifically designed for child pays for parent? And there's even this idea of a keyless anchor, where you can have an output that can be spent by anything with no signature at all for the purpose of adding fees. Ask us like 10 years ago if this was a good idea. We would have said, huh? But turns out it's useful for L2 protocols. And finally, get the other issue of out-of-band fee payment. In fact, if you've looked on mempool.space recently, you may have noticed that there's an accelerator option. And if you pay an extortionate fee, you can get any transaction in the mempool.space mempool mined by the miners who participate. And that's kind of cool. But the payment for that doesn't go through the normal Bitcoin protocol. It goes through a business relationship between mempool.space and the actual miners. Well, why is this an issue? Well, what if you want to become a miner? What if you're sitting there in your basement with, a nice S19 rig and some earplugs? You don't have a business relationship with mempool.space. You're not earning the profit from this. So yeah, it's kind of cool that out-of-band fee payment exists. It can fix problems sometimes, but man, if like every transaction used it, we'd be really screwed. So that's one of the considerations for, we want systems where we can pay fees within the protocol, not rely on centralized business relationships. There's also this thing called replace by fee rate, which is another form of transaction replacement that's meant to prevent pinning. And replace by fee rate, The way I like to describe it is, imagine you go up to a cattle auction. You know, you're wearing a nice big cowboy hat and you confidently step up there and in front of the auctioneer say, you know what, I want to go buy 10,000 cattle for €1 each. And they're probably going to look at you and say, you're an idiot. Surely a cow is worth more than €1. But 10,000 of them is worth €10,000. Now, the way Bitcoin Core works right now is if you then say, oh, you know what, that was kind of dumb of me. I want 2 cows for €500 each. Now, frankly, I'm not a cattleman, so I don't know if €500 is a decent price for a cow, but let's assume it is. Because 2 cows for €500 is only €1,000, Bitcoin Core will reject your second bid. Bitcoin Core only allows you to replace one transaction for another if the total fee goes up. Turns out, this is a way to screw over L2 protocols. Because if in somewhere in the protocol, I can put a big transaction spending an output you need to get spent, that big transaction may have a big fee, but a very low fee rate. And that very low fee rate means it's not going to get mined. But there's no way for you to replace it because it's a very high fee. And that's just going to go sit there until eventually you give up and I steal your money. Well, replaced by fee rate says, that's obviously stupid. Why don't we evaluate transactions based on their fee rate as well? I mean, if you pay a big enough fee rate, shouldn't that be the transaction that gets mined? And in fact, miners to some extent kind of do this already. But Bitcoin Core doesn't implement this in a nice way. And why? Well, because of this other problem we have with mempools called free relay DOS attacks. Now remember, if we have mempools, well, we're passing data around, right? What limits how much data we pass around? I mean, obviously, if we would relay a transaction that paid 0 fees, surely someone could use up all the bandwidth of all the Bitcoin Core nodes out there. So there has to be some kind of limit. Well, the trick with replaced by fee rate and other things we've come up with is if you don't do replacement carefully, you could potentially use up a lot of bandwidth repeatedly replacing transactions. And Satoshi actually made this mistake. You know, transaction replacement existed from day 0 in Bitcoin, but it was implemented by having a number called in sequence that was 32 bits in size, so you could replace a transaction 4 billion times. You know, 4 billion times even 100 bytes of data is a lot of data. Needless to say, Satoshi turned this off after kind of thought through this idea a bit more. And now we use n-sequence for something else. But, you know, it's taken a while to come up with better solutions. But all of these things there's some degree of progress. Certainly, you know, if you're involved in L2s, you have to think about mempools more than you might expect. But I bring it up because there's still a lot of work to be done. Finally, all right, we've said all this stuff. Why do we want to scale these L2 systems anyway? I mean, doesn't Lightning do everything we need? And depending on your assumptions, maybe Lightning is good enough. So one analysis I did as part of this paper was I looked and said, well, how many Lightning channels can we open per year? You know, let's assume that like 90% of available block space is used for opening Lightning channels. What does that number work out to be? And since a Lightning channel open is just the creation of a UTXO, you can batch them together fairly efficiently. And as it turns out, that number is on the order of like 1 billion Lightning channels per year. Now, Lightning channels, you also want to resize them. And of course, for the guys who've used Phoenix, you might know that Phoenix can resize a Lightning channel on the fly. You know, if you add money to a Lightning channel on Phoenix, you can do this on chain. And on chain, it just makes it bigger by adding more funds to it. You can also make it smaller by taking some of the funds, splitting it off, and sending them somewhere else. Now, in an environment where this is really aggressively amortized, you could probably change the capacity of something like, I don't know, a quarter billion Lightning channels per year. That's also a pretty big number. Well, how big a number is that? An interesting stat I found doing the research for this paper is there's an estimated like 4 billion people in the world who own a smartphone. It's even less who own a computer, but who own a smartphone, it's on the order of like 4 billion. Maybe it's 6 now, but it's not that big. It's not the world population, and the world population isn't that big either. So maybe if we can have like 1 billion channels per year, maybe we have enough lightning channels that it's good enough for the world population as it is. Maybe it isn't. But I would certainly say a smartphone is your barrier to entry. Right? If you don't have some computer, why do you even have a lightning channel? I mean, how do you even have a lightning channel? You have to at least have a smartphone to have your own lightning channel. That's your barrier to entry for self-custody. But what if we do want to do better? Well, this is where we need a model that shares one UTXO across multiple users. Now remember, Lightning scales by sharing one UTXO across many transactions. Right? It's kind of has, you kind of imagine, your dimensions. You have users in like UTXOs. And Lightning scales by having more transactions for one single transaction. But if you scale in the other direction at the same time, sharing one UTXO across many different users, now you've added a whole new dimension of scaling. And as we'll explain, there are ways to go do this. The other reason why Lightning isn't ideal is liquidity. Now again, I mentioned changing the balance of a Lightning channel, changing the capacity of a Lightning channel. Well, there's a lot of issues around that. In particular, it's a very bad user experience if you're paying money to receive money. People don't like this very much. And one way you can get around this is, of course, custody. In fact, I've talked to Phoenix on Twitter, and they said they would love to go have a system where Phoenix channels were custodial until they accumulated enough money to be worth an on-chain transaction. But in the like of various criminal cases around the world, they don't really want to touch that. And I don't really blame them. Wald of Satoshi seems to be fine with it, but maybe Wald of Satoshi's a Fed op or something. So if we can have better L2 systems, maybe we can move money around without channels, without transactions. Finally, the last one I want to mention is interactivity. All of these L2s are ultimately some degree of reactive security. You have to go do something in response. And while that seems to be something we can't avoid entirely, we can kind of modify what this means. We can change how the interactivity works, maybe change how the deadlines work, change the consequences for getting it wrong. Maybe even extend, the time period you have. So speaking of, well, after we've gone through all these definitions and our motivation, this gets to, well, the L2 systems I reviewed. And the first one up is very terribly called L2, which is horrendously confusing. And that's why they renamed it L in symmetry. But you may see a lot of stuff still out there referring to L2 as L2. But I'll try to use the word L in symmetry for now on. And well, what is L in symmetry? It's a modification to Lightning that says, rather than punishing the counterparty if they put the wrong state on the chain, instead we will update that state with a new transaction. All right, so you and I have a channel. We've done 1,000 transactions, but I go put the commitment transaction, the state associated with transaction number 1, where I had all the money, and then you fix that problem by putting the state associated with transaction number 1,000, where you have all the money. But the key thing is, in L2, this isn't a punishment, this is an update. You are correcting my misconception about what state I was in. You are not taking my money because I screwed up. And long story short, the way this is proposed to be implemented, and there's a couple different ways, but it's effectively to have the ability to have a transaction that can spend a class of transaction outputs. And that's what sighash any perv out comes down to. And well, in the context of L2 systems, yeah, that changes the interactivity. It makes it less error prone. It makes it less hostile. I'm not clear that L symmetry is actually a good idea, because you probably do need punishment in adversarial cases, or people will just try to screw you over anyway. But there are probably cases where this is useful. And in the next slide, we'll go into channel factories, where maybe L symmetry makes them a lot more easier to implement. But L symmetry by itself doesn't scale L channels. It doesn't let more than one person share one UTXO. So, in the context of this paper, it's not really that interesting. But any prov out, it's kind of cool. You seem to be able to use it for a bunch of stuff. It was proposed many years ago, and people kind of poo-pooed it, saying, well, shit, you can create a lot of transactions that'll make you lose a lot of money, but that seems to be pretty easy to do on Bitcoin anyway, so maybe we should have deployed this like 6 years ago. So, channel factories. Well, this is the first time I'm going to use the term virtual UTXO. Now, remember how Lightning works. Lightning is all about having a transaction or series of transactions that could be mined but isn't. Now, here's an interesting question with Lightning. Can you have a Lightning channel? Can you transact on a Lightning channel where the Lightning out UTXO itself isn't actually on chain yet? And for those of you that have actually used Phoenix, you might know the answer to this. The answer, of course, is yes. It doesn't actually need to be mined yet. Now, there are potentially trust implications involved here, depending on what exactly you're doing, but there's nothing stopping you from having a Lightning channel that isn't actually tied to an on-chain transaction. Well, channel factories takes this observation and says, hang on a second, what if we have a pool of funds shared between multiple people, and we have a transaction that we've all signed that takes that set of funds and splits it up into multiple outputs. And then each one of those outputs is a Lightning channel. As long as this group agree that they want to transact Lightning and use Lightning channels, we don't actually need to mine the setup transaction. It can just kind of stay there floating forever. And what's cool about this is if we eventually decide we want to close our channels, we can collectively agree to do something with that output. If Alice, Bob, and Charlie have 3 channels open, if they decide, you know what, Charlie, you can leave now, well, Alice, Bob, and Charlie can all agree, well, we're going to spend that output, give some of the money to Charlie, some to whoever, and then do something new. Well, that's called a channel factory. Not quite sure where that term came from, but it's the idea of we have these channels that could be made, but aren't actually made. And ideally, if we can all agree, they never have to go on chain. And if we're talking about, say, 3 channels, I don't know, maybe that saves some fees. If we're talking about 1,000 people, maybe that saves a lot of fees. Of course, the problem is, if we're doing all this with setup transactions, how exactly do we get like 1,000 people to agree? What if like one person doesn't agree? Does like all 1,000 have to now go on chain? I mean, this sounds kind of annoying. Well, this is where we get advanced channel factories. And this is where you start getting weird opcodes to do weird things with trees. So in my example with, say, 1,000, you can imagine a script that somehow evaluates some big Merkle tree of how you split up this output and does things like maybe remove one person. Just one person. Everyone else kind of stays in the tree. Or maybe we add one more person. Or maybe we do both at the same time. Or who knows what. And frankly, there's a zillion proposals along these lines. They all have different pluses and minuses. But I think the summary I'd kind of give about all of these is they all kind of seem a bit kludgy, because you do need these special purpose opcodes or maybe a very advanced scripting language to do it. They only work if, for the most part, people all agree. Because if they don't agree, you're all going to end up on chain anyway, and you're going to burn a pile of fees. But, there might be use cases for this. And the cool thing about channel factories is you can do this already. The version where you just collectively sign a transaction, you don't need a new soft fork for this. Bitcoin already supports this. It's just no one's written the code to do it. So, and I've heard there are companies out there doing things with channel factories. And also, there are ways to potentially use channel factories to shift money around without actually changing Lightning channels. Potentially you could imagine, well, if we have a transaction that splits the funds in one way, well, we could also sign another transaction that splits funds in another way. This is potentially very useful between parties like exchanges where, they're online 24/7, but they'd love to be able to not have to play so many liquidity games. Bitfinex, maybe Kraken and maybe Coinbase, if they have Lightning channels with each other, maybe a channel factory could help them move liquidity around in a more efficient way. And at the same time, they're online 24/7, so it's not so bad to expect them to all sign things. But for the purpose of people on their phones trying to transact Lightning, this may not be that useful. What might be useful is ARC. So channel factories, I call them a virtual UTXO system because we had UTXOs that were not expected to actually be put on chain. They're useful in the game theory of it because they could be put on chain, but we don't expect to. Well, ARC takes this idea to the extreme by letting you trade UTXOs. And the way I can kind of explain it is ARC is about having an ARC service provider and then a bunch of people using that ARC service provider. And the ARC service provider's role is to provide liquidity. They provide funds. And the funds they provide are then split up into virtual UTXOs through a chain of potential transactions. One version that can actually be implemented already is you just pre-sign transactions. The other version that's likely to be implemented is with covenants, such as check template verify, where you have a pool of money and you split that pool into smaller subpools till finally it drills down to an actual virtual UTXO. Now, obviously, if you have a UTXO that can be split into a pile of virtual UTXOs, you could imagine owning one of these virtual UTXOs. You always have the option of going on chain because you have that UTXO. The problem is, if that's all you've done, you're going to have to go on chain to get your money. So the very clever trick ARC does is it does this in rounds. And each round has a timeout. Generally proposed to be maybe 1 month long. And these virtual UTXOs are created. 1 month later, the timeout is reached, and the ARC service provider can take all the money. But if you have many rounds, you can sell your virtual UTXO and get a new one in a new round. How do you sell your virtual UTXO? Well, you sign a transaction that takes that money and then gives it back to the ARC service provider. And that means if somehow the virtual UTXO does go on chain, the ARC service provider gets their money back, admittedly minus fees, which can be an issue. But that fixes one side of it. They will get their money. And then yet it still allows you to sell your UTXO and get a new one, thus extending the time period that your UTXO is valid for. And a very cool thing about this is, since you can create a virtual UTXO, you can play the same game that channel factories do. You can actually open a Lightning channel in ARC with a virtual UTXO. Because your counterparty knows that if they need to go on chain, they can by publishing the transactions that kind of go down that tree and create that virtual UTXO, making it just as real a Lightning channel as anything else. So that's cool, but in addition to being really complex, and believe me, I only explained like 10% of ARC's complexity, the other thing about ARC is it really has this very weird liquidity problem. Because remember, if I own a virtual UTXO, that is my money, right? I have signing authority on it. I'm not loaning it from anyone or anything. But when I get a new round, when I sell my virtual UTXO, I'm effectively telling the counterparty, the ASP provider, hey, you're going to get this money eventually, but I want some new money now. And the difference between when I sold and when they're going to get their money back is effectively the time period that they need to borrow liquidity. You know, you imagine like the ARC service provider. Let's suppose they have no Bitcoin at all. So every time they do a round, they're borrowing money from somewhere else. Obviously, that's going to have a cost. You know, money isn't free. Now, the US government may disagree, but money is not free. And as long as Bitcoin does not have the Fed, there is a limited supply of it out there, and the ASP is going to have to borrow from somewhere. And the weird thing about it is the closer you get to the end of the round, the lower the cost is to spend a virtual UTXO and ARC. But then, of course, the earlier, the higher the cost is. Now, I don't really have a good feeling for what this cost is going to be. And it's a weird safety thing, too, because one way of using ARC would be to go trust the ASP to give you a new UTXO in a new round. So if you trust them, there is actually no liquidity cost, or at least a very, very minor one. But if you don't trust them, the sooner you try to move your money, the more money you're going to pay just to have a wallet. I don't know if this user experience makes sense. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But the cool thing about ARC is, since it is based on covenants, and a type of covenant they can implement now with pre-signed transactions, people are actually making real ARC implementations that will actually be able to be used in production. Again, everyone has to sign everything, so it can only be used with a group of people who are constantly online, but at least we'll get some idea of what this liquidity problem looks like in reality. Now, I have one more big sort of L2 system that I reviewed, and this is sort of the really crazy one. This is a whole class of ones that kind of basically get called roll-ups. And the idea with a roll-up is, what if we have another blockchain or some kind of similar consensus structure tied to Bitcoin UTXOs, or for that matter, Ethereum UTXOs? Yes, Ethereum has UTXOs if you squint a bit and think about what accounts really mean. But if you do transactions on the secondary system, you can imagine proving to the primary system that all these transactions were done correctly. And if you can somehow prove that, you can roll up the state changes, all the different transitions between money moving from one party to another, and you can apply that state change to the primary system, which in the case of of Bitcoin would mean that would be the rules for spending a UTXO. Now, there's this whole class of mathematical monstrosities called zero-knowledge proofs, and a particularly interesting one is called, let's see if I get this right, zero-knowledge succinct arguments of computation or knowledge or something like that. Anyway, ZK snarks. And the ZK part of this is kind of by accident, because the cool thing snarks do is they basically let you prove to a third party that you ran a computer program on a piece of data. So I can say, hey, I have this Merkle tree of state changes, all the different ways transactions moved money around in the system. I proved to you I ran this fancy computer program, namely the validator, on that Merkle tree and all the data associated with it. And the output of that computer program was most likely true. Well, what might true mean? Well, true might mean the transaction I am proposing to spend those coins with follows all the rules, and thus the balance change is correct. And ZK snarks are, to the if they work, they are exceptionally powerful mathematical tools. They can do kind of damn near anything. Unfortunately, they involve a lot of math where we're still not really sure if it actually works. In comparison, like ECC, Schnorr signatures, ECDSA, all this, that math we're very, very confident it works. Bitcoin has had like $1 trillion bounty on ECC. If you can break ECC, you can earn a lot of money. Admittedly, not $1 trillion because you'll crash the price first, but you could probably make yourself a billionaire. Snarks just hasn't had that level of scrutiny. Zcash does use snarks, but I don't know if you've looked at the price of Zcash lately. It's pretty low compared to Bitcoin. So, there's just not that maturity there. And the problem for Bitcoin is, well, we're not going to add an opcode to validate a snark, right? Like, the mathematicians don't agree on which one is correct. So we could emulate the validity opcode by using a whole bunch of other opcodes, and very clever people have argued that opcat can do this. Pure concatenation is arguably enough. Creates very big transactions, but they say it can go do this. And that's all well and good. But even if all this works, you still run into the problem of it's not actually clear these are real L2s. Because remember, I just said I can prove that all the rules were followed and the money should be moved. But to prove that, someone actually needs to run that computer program and all that data. All right? I can't do this without the data. I actually need to have this data. But how do you make sure that all the users in the system have access to that data? Now, a lot of roll-ups on the Ethereum world, they fix this problem by just putting all the data on the chain. But if you do that, where's the scaling improvement? If you don't do that, is it actually an L2? Maybe you can have some kind of challenge response thing where you pressure the other guy into publishing the data or they lose some bounty, but, is the economics of that always our second criteria where you can punish them for fraud? It's actually not clear. These things get very complex. So is roll-ups an L2 system? Well, it depends on the details. And more importantly, all this stuff is very advanced moon math. We're not really clear it works. So frankly, from the Bitcoin community, no one's really seriously looking at roll-ups. A lot of quote-unquote shitcoiners are looking at this because they'd love to create all kinds of fancy financial shenanigans. But Bitcoiners, for the most part, want to send money around. And ARC seems pretty good at that. Lightning seems pretty good at that. Roll-ups, it's not clear you need that. So we went through all these L2s. But a key thing to consider with them is, if we're putting more users on the same chain, what happens when something goes wrong? Right? So with L1 Bitcoin, every transaction that's it. You do a transaction, you put data in the chain, you move your money around, that's it. With Lightning, the ratio of transactions to users has now gone up a lot. I could go do like 1 million transactions with one UTXO. Well, what happens if, as an example, Phoenix goes down? All right? Actually, for that matter, what happens if Phoenix Wallet, the Lightning service provider behind that, what if it goes haywire and it tries to commit fraud on all of the Phoenix users all at once? You could imagine it closing. Well, let's be nice to them. Let's say they have 10 million users. What if all 10 million users suddenly see in the blockchain transactions that close their channel with an invalid state? Well, now you have 10 million users trying to get 10 million more transactions, at least, into the Bitcoin chain to punish the Phoenix Lightning service provider and get their money back. Does the chain have enough space for this? That's a good question. And what happens if Phoenix scales to like 1 billion users? Now we may have some bigger problems. Now with Lightning at least, it's 1 UTXO per channel. So if Phoenix wants to screw over a user, they need to get a transaction mined in the first place. All right? Like Phoenix can't screw you over until they get a transaction mined. If they haven't mined a transaction, they haven't screwed you over yet. So you could say that the Failure case, the ratio of data between it working and it not working is, I don't know, roughly speaking, maybe double-ish, triple or something. All right, that's the additional load it puts on the chain when something goes wrong. Well, that was all well and cool. What if we have 1 billion people using one ARC service provider? You have one UTXO that normally is only ever spent with one transaction. Maybe a few more if some people, withdraw their VUTXOs, but it's roughly speaking one-ish. Now that ARC service provider goes offline and they stop responding to requests. Every single one of those 1 billion people has a ticking time bomb. Unless they get a transaction mined, the ARC service provider gets to keep their money. All right, because the timeout gets reached and they get to keep all the money. I haven't seen anyone really think through how this looks in reality. And depending on how we set up ARC, and there's a lot of nuanced ways to actually write the ARC scripts on chain, maybe ARC isn't actually an L2, because if the ARC service provider can rely on the fact that they can just let the chain fill up and let fees go crazy, maybe they in fact do make an economic profit by trying to take everyone's money. If it costs money to get your money back, well, maybe it costs too much. And the concern I have about all these fancy L2s is we haven't seen something like Phoenix fail. We've seen big lightning nodes go down, we've seen them close, but for the most part, when they've closed, they've always kind of closed in a cooperative way. One example is the zero-fee routing guy, who I think was, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago? He had, 10,000 channels or something crazy, and he decided to get out of that business because he wasn't earning any money. And running a lightning node with 10,000 channels is just too stressful. So he said, look, you've got like 4 weeks and you better start closing your channels. And he started cooperatively closing them, and it was a nice gradual process. Fees probably went up a little bit, but not in a detectable way. Phoenix, realistically, they probably have less than 1 million users. Probably a fair bit less than that. Even if they go down, we still don't really know what this looks like. I would argue that we might not be ready yet to actually make ARC available on-chain for end users, because we just haven't seen this play out in reality. Maybe it's okay, maybe it isn't, but a lot more analysis needs to be done, and this is a good reason not to rush into covenants too quickly. So with that, well, the path forward. Nothing at all is an option. Like I said, there's probably 4 billion people with smartphones, and we can actually get Lightning to a big chunk of them. Now, maybe we can't get Lightning to that many people if a whole bunch of ordinals and inscriptions and all that are competing for chain space. But assuming that's a flash in the pan and, it's a fad that goes away, maybe it's enough to just do nothing. Now, Sighash any priv out, like I said, by itself, it doesn't really do anything. For scaling, doesn't cause problems with failure data ratio. It makes certain types of lightning channels more attractive, and it's type of lightning channel which arguably isn't actually something that will be widely used. And like I said, maybe we should have enabled this 6 years ago. CTV is nice because there's a lot of things it can be used for, and it doesn't do anything too clever. Now, the fancy tree manipulation magic opcodes, like the opovict and all the stuff for advanced channel factories, I think realistically we can say this is not going to happen, because how are you going to get the Bitcoin community to get consensus on something so niche? It's cool to write papers about, but it's just not actually going to happen. OpCat, well, like I said, OpCat can enable basically anything because of ZK snarks. And do we really want to make anything possible? I'm not sure the answer to that is yes. Unintended consequences are a thing, and we might want to not rush into these kinds of consequences that quickly. We don't know what people are going to use OpCat for, and it's very hard to predict. And the people pushing it are the same people who also want to make a lot of money with inscriptions, and that's kind of suspicious. We also know for a fact some of them want to use it for like trading tokens directly on chain, which, we can't stop some versions of that. Filtering, Luke Jr. is wrong. Filtering doesn't work. But we may not want to add things to consensus to actually make this even easier. Now, check sig from stack, I've got some slides, I'll kind of go into some details there, but that's something we're probably going to have as a part of these things. And it's also a funny opcode in that you can actually emulate it through crazy ECC math magic. In L-enhance, I bring that up because I think it's an interesting cautionary tale. So if you actually look at my blog and actually read through it, you'll notice the L-enhance section, I kind of say, well, these guys claim it would be good for channel factories and L-n symmetry and whatnot, but the BIPs themselves don't explain what's going on. They explain what opcodes they're proposing, which is a combination of CTV, checksig from stack, and something called internal key, but they don't explain why these are useful. Now, they've written tons of forum posts, but it's not my role as a researcher evaluating L2 systems and covenants to trawl through, Bitcoin Talk forum posts and figure out what the hell you were proposing. My role is to go read your proposal. And if you didn't make a proposal, well, tough luck. In fact, CTV had that problem early on too, because frankly, the first CTV BIP was kind of crap. It didn't explain why it was useful. It kind of had some use cases that didn't really make sense. And obviously, you could use it for more than that, but the guy behind it didn't actually argue his case. And finally, sort of the biggest contrast to nothing at all is a proposal that's kind of come up recently called script revival. Or another term for it I like is Satoshi's vision. And Satoshi's vision is to re-enable all of the opcodes that Satoshi disabled. Now, you young kids might not know this, but back in the day, Bitcoin did have opcat. Bitcoin had op-XOR. Bitcoin had multiply and divide. It had a zillion things. And back in roughly 2010 or so, Satoshi, in a commit that didn't say it was doing this, disabled all this stuff all of a sudden. Well, for opcat at least, there was an obvious reason why you would disable it, was because there's no limit on how big of a thing it could push to the stack. So if you do 1 byte, duplicate it, opcat, duplicate it, opcat, duplicate it, opcat, every round of that is going to double the size of the top stack item. Well, you can double the size of the top stack item, easy 64 times, and that's enough to, cover the entire planet in grains of rice like a meter deep. That's a famous chessboard problem. 1 grain of rice doubled each time. Well, doubling gets you to big numbers pretty quick. And Satoshi probably thought, shoot, I really should have spent more time on these opcodes before I released them. Speaking of, my personal suspicion is Satoshi was like a student or a professor and was rushing to finish Bitcoin before the semester started again in January. But anyway, script revival. Now that we have the benefit of experience, yeah, maybe we can enable all this stuff. But if we enable everything, well, everything's possible, and it's not really clear where that goes. So I suspect script revival, as cool as it is not going anywhere. Out of all these things, Ccash any prov out seems harmless. Ccash or opctv seems useful, and maybe useful enough to do a soft fork, but most of this is probably going to get ruled out by politics because it's just too much effort to do simple things. And something I didn't actually put on here is we might even want to do a soft fork before we add new covenants, purely to go clean up the scripting or the Bitcoin consensus. You may have heard of the off by 1 error in the difficulty adjustment, which creates the time warp attack. And there's a whole lot of other things like this. I mean, the fact that we even have to have filters on transactions is actually mainly because Bitcoin script version 0 has tons of DOS attacks. Satoshi did not, in fact, disable enough opcodes to fix it. In fact, one of the opcodes he would have had to disable is op-checksig. And we're not going to disable that one, so there's a bunch of stuff we kind of could do to go clean all this up. But we'll see how that goes. Now, let's get a little bit nitty gritty and like what these things actually look like under the hood. So check sig from stack, as it suggests, is to check a signature from the stack against data on the stack. And that can create a covenant because you can check a signature on a stack from the serialized transaction in the output, or the digest of it, and then use the same signature to check sig for the transaction. And to be technical, it would be the digest of the way that transactions are serialized for the purpose of check sig and so on. But long story short, what's interesting to hear is you actually have two different opcodes that can do the same thing. CTV can actually be emulated by check sig from stack. It's not as obvious, but you can do it. Now opcat, well, I keep on talking about opcat, but like how would it enable a covenant? Well, by itself, opcat does not enable a covenant. But what you can do with it is you can use it in conjunction with something like a check sig from stack to take your serialized transaction or parts of it and build it up, hash it, and then use that same trick to check that it matches the spending transaction. Well, why is this useful? Well, check template verify, what it can do is somewhat limited. It's a template. It matches exactly one thing. But opcat, with enough scripting magic, you could imagine a script that checks that a type of transaction is the one mining it. Maybe, we restrict the first couple outputs to one thing, but then other outputs are allowed to be something else, which might be useful. I mean, maybe we allow outputs to be added, or I should say inputs be added, that add money for fees. Because one issue with CTV is there isn't an obvious way to pay fees in CTV. In a lot of cases, you're only going to have one CTV option, so one potential fee option. It's cool, but what I have on the screen here is way simpler than how you would actually use opcat. And it may be that when we actually look into the details of how you'd use it, maybe we need a whole bunch of opcodes. Maybe we need opcodes to validate like partial serialized transactions. Who knows? And finally, I want to go point out that if you have opcat, a lot of the ways you're going to use it, you also want op CTV. Because CTV is a more direct way of checking that did this thing that you serialized, does it actually match the output? Because so many opcat use cases would be take a transaction, build it up, just make sure it's the same thing as output. Well, how do you make sure it's the same thing? CTV is an obvious way to go do it. Finally, and I think this is more, this is really more relevant to the roll-ups type of L2, but something I haven't really seen discussed that much is that, L2s are in a way a shared database. So let's go back to our lightning channel example. I have a lightning channel with you. For us to have a lightning channel, we have to have agreement on what state it's in. If we have agreement on what state it's in, we also have agreement on what states it was in. So we have, between ourselves, a type of shared consensus. It's a very simple example, but it's sort of a type of shared consensus. All right, what if we have a channel factory? Well, what if it's not just me, it's me and 100 others of you? Again, we have a type of shared consensus. It's not a very complex one in that case, but it's like we're all kind of exchanging data around the state of these channels. In the case of channel factories, I don't really care that much what your channel is doing, but at the very least I do care whether or not your channel is being put on chain. Now in Arc, that shared consensus gets a little more complex, because if I own an Arc virtual UTXO, and you own an Arc virtual UTXO, and I want to put mine on chain, that does affect, to a degree, how you would put yours on chain. Not in a huge way. You can just kind of look on the chain and say, oh yeah, that intermediate transaction got mined. All right, I don't necessarily need to mine that again. But again, there's a bit of a shared state. Roll-ups, well, that's when you get a really strong shared consensus shared database. And if roll-ups work, if these secondary databases work, every fully participating member in them actually needs a whole lot of state that they need to understand, especially if it's something like a roll-up of a blockchain-like data structure. And an interesting thing about this is, well, how would you implement a database? Like with cryptography, if we have a shared database and a cryptographic system, like what does it actually look like? How do we take that state and put it into the crypto world? Well, we're going to wind up using Merkle trees. And for starters, we're going to wind up using trees because trees are the answer to everything in computer science. And cryptography adds hashes to everything, so we're going to have Merkle trees. You may laugh at this, but it's surprising how accurate this statement actually is. You know, everything in cryptography that's non-trivial winds up being a Merkle tree. Well, if we have some kind of shared data structure consensus that we do a roll-up on, we're probably going to have a Merkle tree over the state of it if we want to do anything more complex than just collapse the whole thing at once. And since we're doing that, if users exit, they need to be able to convince the chain that something is true, but also they need to be able to update other people on what they changed, right? Because remember we talked about roll-ups, about this data availability problem, how, you know, how exactly does everyone else learn what's happened in the roll-up when someone exits or someone does a transaction? Well, if it is actually an L2, it's probably going to be a system where to exit that roll-up, that secondary consensus, I have to update everyone else but the thing I changed by exiting. You know, in Arc, interestingly enough, Arc is based on a Merkle tree, right? Because you have your virtual UTXO, you split it up into a bunch of smaller and smaller pools. Or sorry, you have your UTXO, you split up in a bunch of smaller and smaller pools, and eventually you get to virtual UTXOs. Well, that data structure is going to be a Merkle tree. And when I exit, I am updating you about the new state of that data structure by proving to you the part that I changed, the status where I went from, you know, off-chain to on-chain. And what's interesting about this is it says something about the scalability of these systems. If they are L2s, I strongly suspect that they have something like log 2 scaling, because that's your scalability of getting out of a Merkle tree. And things like Arc actually do better than this. Well, maybe not so much better, but you know, they do this the most efficient way, because in Arc, as people exit the Arc tree, more of that data is on chain, and further exits can reuse the data that's already been put on. All right, if everyone in an Arc system exits, roughly speaking, they've used twice as much data as to create the virtual UTXOs. The real number is a little different than that, but you know, roughly speaking, it's twice, because the number of elements in a tree, in a binary tree, of n is 2n. And that's kind of interesting. And it kind of says something about how these systems really work. I'm not sure it says something very relevant yet, because no one's ever built any of these things. But it kind of says something about the limits of what's possible here. And with that, thank you. Yeah. Yes, so questions, obviously. Yeah, so the question is, are there differences between, Satoshi's original opcat and what's proposed now? I mean, of course, one obvious difference is you can't crash it. And the way that would be achieved is just by putting limits on the maximum output of opcat. But other than that, I don't think there really would be any meaningful differences. I mean, obviously, like for implementation reasons, we can't actually turn that opcode back on. If we want to have a soft fork, because that opcode is disabled, if we release a version of Bitcoin Core where it's enabled, prior versions of Bitcoin are just going to see a failure, and the network will immediately fork. So the way we would actually do it is by taking advantage of TapScript's ability well, I should say tap scripts op success opcodes, which what they do is if execution reaches that point, the script immediately returns true. And then you add rules to that by making the script sometimes return false. And how do you add those rules? Well, by actually making the opcode do something. So yeah, that'll probably be how it works, but you're correct to ask that question, and yeah, there would be no meaningful difference. We would have to make some decisions about like how big an output an opcat could have. One obvious way to go do it would be, say, an opcat output could be as big as a transaction could possibly be. But that's like a megabyte, and maybe we don't want to have a megabyte on the stack. I don't quite know how that would play out. There's also an alternative to opcat for the purpose of covenant type things that would be not opcat, but rather incremental hashing. So you can imagine an opcode which sort of pushes a SHA-256 initial state to the stack, and then allows you to go add new things to that state, hashing more things, and eventually turning that state into a SHA-256 digest. And that implements what we want opcat for by letting you build up a thing that you're hashing and eventually getting the digest. And since you're building up the hashing incrementally, the maximum size of state necessary to do this is the state of SHA-256, which, if I remember off the top of my head, I think it's 512 bits. Yeah, probably 512 bits or something, which is much smaller than, of course, 1 megabyte. But I don't know. Those are a lot of implementation decisions, and there's endless variety in how we could implement that. But hope that answers your question. All right. Well, so I think the question there is really like an economics question, which is, how much value is enough to have a UTXO? And I think the answer is we don't know that. I mean, we just don't, because it's an economic question. And, even day to day, we see fee rates vary quite a lot. Great example being, well, when the crazy inscription people decide to go create yet another scammy inscription nonsense token, economically, that is a spike in demand for block space, which pushes fees up enormously, but for a short period of time. And then those transactions get mined, and economically, demand has just dropped off again. I mean, last I looked, fee rates were like 2 sats per vbyte. So you could say the market says that enough is, 2 sats per vbyte, whether or not that's economical for use case. But, in 10 minutes, that could jump up to 1,000 sats per vbyte. And honestly, the simple answer there is, it's just economics, and there's nothing we as technologists can do to tame that. In much the same way is that nothing in the Bitcoin protocol can say what the price of Bitcoin should be. That's purely supply and demand, which is a security problem for Bitcoin, because even in the regime where security is paid through by inflation, is at least currently 0.5% of the value of Bitcoin per year of the whole market cap. If you send that to miners, is that enough to pay for 51% stack security? There is no technological answer to that question. And the best we can really do is things like these L2s, which try to give people options to delay spending. And I got to point out, Lightning does this. When you open Lightning channels, you are creating an option to move money around in the future. But when you actually choose to use that option, it doesn't matter what fees are, because the channel's already open. Similarly, even if you're using Lightning in sort of a unidirectional way, where the movement of money has one direction and flows from one party to another, rebalancing that unidirectional flow is something you can do on chain, right? I can go take money over there, send it back here, or vice versa, or whatever. Well, when I choose to do that, I can choose to do it at low fee rates because there isn't as much time pressure. But again, it's only giving people an option, and there is no technological answer to that. Oh, hang on. So I think, so your question is how does privacy play into proposed changes to Bitcoin? Well, here, let me answer that one first. So, I didn't mention privacy at all in any of this. And one reason why I kind of didn't is because L2s inherently have better privacy than on-chain. Certainly against, it depends on your threat model, but against most threat models, L2s are just fundamentally better. It doesn't matter whether or not you use like Wallet of Satoshi or your own L&D node. They're fundamentally better in that, at the very least, your transactions aren't broadcast to the entire world. So one way Bitcoin can improve privacy is simply to make L2s better. And the more people use L2s, the more transactions happen on them. That inherently just gets you better privacy. It may not be perfect. I mean, you may have people using Wallet of Satoshi or an equivalent, but you're never going to be worse off than having a small number of people use on-chain transactions. And then the other thing, I think the other kind of implied part of that question, and I don't want to pick on you necessarily, but usually when this topic comes up, people are really comparing Bitcoin to coins like Monero or Zcash, which have strong guarantees of privacy on the chain itself. Those coins are cool, they're interesting, but they're very risky. And they're risky because if you screw up, you can't audit the money supply. And we've seen this happen in Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin has had an inflation bug. And that inflation bug, even though it happened in, I think, 2010 or so, when very few people were watching the chain, it was still an exploit that was caught within minutes. Because at least one person was looking at transactions and realized, hang on a second, more money came out of that than went in. Obviously, that's wrong. And when that was noticed, they raised the alarm on Bitcoin Talk, if I remember. And very quickly, people noticed, well, obviously that's wrong. We should go fix this. Well, what went wrong? Oh, obviously it's that line of code in the thing that checks the funds coming in out of a transaction. We had a signed comparison when it should be an unsigned or something like that. I think it was like signed overflow or something like that. Any idiot with even the tiniest bits of programming experience could look at like a signed and unsigned comparison and find that error and figure out potentially how to go fix it. Now, admittedly, Craig Wright, he is sufficiently dumb that he wouldn't be able to go fix that. He famously answered the question in deposition, well, what's an unsigned integer? Gee, I don't know. For the record, unsigned integer is an integer that hasn't proven itself to be Craig Wright. But, long story short is the math in Bitcoin for that kind of thing is very simple. Now, maybe we'll find a problem in ECC cryptography and then we're really screwed, but that seems unlikely. Monero, on the other hand, I think at the moment they've had, one or two on-chain inflation exploits that could have been exploited to kill the entire currency. And those ones weren't even problems with the math, as I recall. It was implementation errors. Well, even with an implementation error, because it does have good privacy, you could create a huge pot of inflated coins, use the math correctly, spread your pot around to a whole bunch of UTXOs or equivalent, and then use that later on to destroy the currency. Zcash, it's had the same thing. Pre-release, they had to delay the release because there was an inflation exploit. And then they had one more, which famously they hid for months and lied about the status of their trusted setup to go hide the fact they'd done this. And I think they had maybe one more on top of that was more minor. But these are things that can go kill the whole currency. And like it or not, I don't think it's worth taking that risk right now for Bitcoin, because it's $1 trillion asset. And frankly, if Bitcoin dies, I don't think we get a second chance at creating another proof of work system. It's kind of a bit of a miracle that Bitcoin didn't get 51% attacked in early days. We got very lucky on that. So I wouldn't want to take that risk. Although there is one thing we can do, purely on-chain, is we can do cross-input signature aggregation, which is to say that rather than having one signature, or potentially more than one, per input, we use clever ECC cryptography to essentially add the signatures together and then validate them all at once. And what's cool about that is you create a financial incentive for CoinJoin. We already have a financial incentive for CoinJoins because you can save on bytes by sharing the transaction header between different transactions. But cross-input signature aggregation is a much bigger incentive because it's a lot more bytes per input basically. And if we do that, and we implement this, when you go and send, coins to Kraken that are coin joined, the answer will not be, no, I was trying to go hide things. It's, yeah, I'm trying to save bytes. What, you don't like saving bytes? Screw you. So it would be cool to see that, but as far as I know, no one has a concrete proposal for that yet. So maybe one day. Yes, the question is, what about using client-side validation for scaling? And so one type of clients, well, I should say, for some applications, we already do this. My own open timestamps protocol is a great example. It's a very, very dumb and simple example, but it does scale with client-side validation. It's just all it scales is timestamps. And I might be the person who's created the largest Merkle tree ever in anger, because I timestamped everything I could download, or at least the metadata I could download off the Internet Archive, which was like, a bit under 1 billion items at once with one single Bitcoin transaction. I don't know of anyone who's done better than that. I hope someone does, but as far as I know, no one's done better than that. So, that is an example of client-side validation and scaling. But, the more interesting example is to use it for financial transactions. And I have a blog post from 2017 at petertodd.org that talks about how to use straightforward, no moon math, no clever tricks, client-side validation to scale transactions per second to arbitrary amounts with Merkle trees. And, with relatively little data, like you could do a token transfer system sending like 1 billion tokens per second. The catch is, if you're going to do something simple with no clever math, this works through what's called proof of publication. That is, the definition of a valid token transfer in that system is that I publish a valid signature in some kind of Merkleized publication log where previously in that place in that log there was no valid signature. In Bitcoin, a way to think about this is imagine if Bitcoin did not have block validity rules. Like imagine if a Bitcoin block was valid so long as the proof of work was valid. That's it. No rules beyond that whatsoever. It's just a big chunk of data. Well, you could implement a currency on top of this proof of work system by adding rules that check the validity of that data. And so long as we implement the same rules, we will come to the same conclusion, and we can transact coins on this. The clever version of scaling with that is to split up that chunk of data with a Merkle tree and publish things in particular places in that tree. And I'd suggest you read my blog post on it and get a piece of paper out and draw some diagrams. It's very cool, but the catch is the trust mechanism in that to get the scaling is trusted with respect to censorship resistance, untrusted with respect to validity. Because the math proves the validity of the coin by itself, but you can't necessarily spend your token because you have to be able to get data into that publication tree. And if the people in control of that won't let you in, you're screwed. You can play games like have a 2 out of 3 or who knows what, or run the tree yourself, but this is the kind of trade-off it has. Now, more recently, people have proposed to use like ZK snark proof things to do better than this. And kind of a way to go talk about this is to say that some ways you may be able to do better than this is by effectively forcing people to sort of let your data into the data structure. It's not clear how well this really works in practice, but there may be avenues for that. Certainly, in the trust model that I just described, you can prove the validity of a token with less data, because rather than giving you like megabytes worth of transaction history, I could just give you a short math proof. But frankly, all of this is kind of immature. None of these things are as well understood as L1, You know, they can certainly work for certain types of tokens. In fact, I have an RGB token from years ago, and you know, the trading part works fine. But is this something that we can apply to Bitcoin itself? Not until we have the ability to evaluate zero-knowledge proofs on Bitcoin itself. And right now, we're not going to do that with like an op zkp verify, and doing that with an op cat is sketchy. And if we do it with an op cat, the transactions are going to be massive. So validating proof is going to be expensive. So it's a ways off in the future, but you know, give it 10 years, maybe that's how we transact Bitcoin. So the question is there a potential for an L3 to go solve L2 problems? And, I mean, yeah, there is potential for an L3 for sure, which is we can take L2, our marketing term, and we can add 1 to it. And then we have L3, problem solved. In fact, we can do better than that. So I know a lot of you guys have heard of like Web 1 devs and Web 2 devs, and some people even claim to be Web 3 devs. Well, the most rational thing to go do is Web 3, but the most irrational thing to do is Web Pi. Now, has anyone come up with a coherent term for L3? No, I've never seen a claim like that. And honestly, in a way you could call something like Arc used with Lightning in L3, in the sense that you have one layer that creates a virtual UTXO, and then another layer that manages Lightning channel on top of that. But in that model, you know, if you're going to call something an L3, maybe the Lightning channel is L3, because it's using another L2 layer to create that scaling. I don't think people in our community are going to call it that, but who knows? I mean, you know, at some point it's all just marketing. Like I could have said in my definitions, we're going to call it a foosball, and foosball systems are this. You know, it's just a name in the end of it. In much the same way as that people still like to call liquid an L2. I like to call liquid a bank, but you know, I can't stop them from calling it an L2. Well, yeah, which of the software proposals? So the one I reviewed that it would definitely be okay to activate is the consensus cleanup. You know, but that doesn't enable anything new. That just stops attacks. Out of the rest of them, I think CTV is probably your best lot. And, you know, frankly, I mean, I've opposed CTV before. When Jeremy Rubin came out with it in a BIP that frankly wasn't very good, I opposed it on the basis that, look, you just haven't done the work yet. But it's been some time since then, and other people have done more work to show CTV is useful. And hopefully someone will take the CTV BIP and actually write it properly and explain these use cases properly. You know, propose an activation method that's sane rather than, yeah, let's do an emergency soft fork, please run my forked client. But, you know, that's probably going to be a 2-3 year process. And maybe more. I mean, personally, my check lock time verify opcode, which I got enabled in I think 2016 or so. You know, that was something like a 2 or 3 year project, and check lock time verify was much more clearly useful at the time. I think CTV has the potential to be that clearly useful, but people need to do the work. And with all this stuff, you know, it's really a matter of politics. Like, unless you do the work and show that your thing is useful, nobody cares about your code. You know, nobody cares about your forum posts. You really got to go do the work and carefully outline why this is good. And once you've done that, convince other people and convince more people and convince more people. And CTV is probably the thing that has the most potential there. But certainly I would argue we probably should do the consensus cleanup first and fix all these DOS attacks. But we'll see what happens.
Another round of applause.